there's a hair of unhealthy, get off. Where the fuck coping mechanism? Where is it? Maladaptive coping mechanism. Establish. There it is. Problem. The situation and no. Hey guys, welcome back. As y'all know, I've been going on a series about bipolar disorder. Now, in my last video, I talked about how to get stable with bipolar disorder, and I mentioned coping mechanisms and that I would go further into detail about them. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Coping mechanisms are very important. Everyone has them, and we all need them. However, in the case of mental health, it's even more important, and we absolutely need them. It doesn't matter what kind of mental illness you have, or even if you don't have a mental illness. Now, obviously, I have bipolar disorder, and I also have anxiety and some trauma. However, coping mechanisms are not reserved for bipolar disorder or trauma or anxiety, or even just mental illness. Coping skills can drastically affect your mental and emotional well-being. People who are resilient to trauma and stress often have learned how to cope with those things in a healthy way. Life is always going to have anxious moments, trauma moments, stressful moments, but if you can cope with those things, then it can really affect the quality of your life. Sometimes coping helps manage specific problems, and sometimes coping just helps manage specific emotions. Now, if you don't know what coping mechanisms are, they're basically strategies or mechanisms with which to manage or tolerate feelings of stress or painful or difficult emotions. Those can be overwhelming emotions, trauma, mental illness, but there's also things just like having an argument, hurting someone's feelings, getting a bad grade or report back at work, any number of life events. Examples of those events could be marital problems or divorce, death or chronic illness, loss of a job or poor job performance, even things that are generally seen as positive like marriage, having a child, buying a home, starting a new career. I mean, all of these things can lead to stress. Now, there's a difference between stress and toxic stress, but regardless, we all need coping mechanisms with which to deal with that stress. Coping mechanisms are generally conscious decisions to manage an external situation that is causing internal stress. However, I've noticed with myself that I sometimes cope without realizing. For example, I used to read all of the time and watch Netflix all of the time, specifically Supernatural and Doctor Who. Yes, I was one of those people. To escape reality and cope by not dealing with what I was dealing with. By not dealing with the negative feelings I was feeling. There's two types of coping styles. There's active and there's avoidant. Active coping mechanisms are knowingly used to reduce stress with awareness of what the stressor is. Avoidant coping mechanisms are used to avoid the stressor or problem, and this can be knowingly or unknowingly. There are also problem-based and emotional-based coping mechanisms. Emotionally based coping skills are helpful for when you don't have control over the situation and you just have to manage the feelings that you're feeling, when you need to take care of your feelings, but the situation or circumstances are out of your control. Problem-based coping skills are when you can change your situation by removing or resolving something stressful. Something to ask yourself when you need to cope is it an emotion or is it a situation? Do you need to face it head on, or is it something that you should just try to move forward from, like being angry about something you can't control or change? Then you need to ask yourself if you are avoiding the problem or actively dealing with it. Some of the more commonly used coping mechanisms have to do with support, relaxation, problem solving, humor, and physical activity. Support-centered coping mechanisms, which are generally emotionally based, could be talking to somebody who is supportive about what's causing you negative emotions, or seeking an external source of support instead of isolating yourself and internalizing everything. Now, I'll be honest, I am an internalizer. I'm more likely to isolate than I am to reach out. But recently I have been seeking external sources for support, and it feels much better to share those problems with other people instead of just dealing with it on my own. So if you struggle with reaching out to an external source that is a person for support, you could try giving yourself a pep talk or journaling about the issue so you at least get it out of your system and it's not just reverberating in your head. Relaxation-centered coping mechanisms obviously have to do with relaxing yourself to manage or reduce the stress and the intensity of the emotions you're feeling. This can be meditation, calming techniques, taking a long shower shower or bath, being in nature, listening to music, playing with your animals, watching a TV show or movie that is calming and happy or positive, whatever helps you relax. Problem-solving centered coping mechanisms are more direct in resolving the issue that is causing you stress and emotions. So identifying the problem, creating an action plan, and putting that action plan into place. Solving said problem, or resolving said problem, or reducing said problem. Now, this only works if your stressor or problem can be resolved or reduced, if it's something in your control. This could look like managing your time better, or asking for literal help to complete or resolve something, establishing healthy boundaries in your relationships so emotional stress or abuse is reduced, removing unhealthy relationships from your life, or creating a to-do list when you feel stressed about how many things you need to accomplish. Next is humor-centered coping mechanisms, something I use very often. Anytime I talk about something that is uncomfortable, upsetting, or traumatic, I laugh while talking about it, and it helps me make light of the situation and not feel so upset about it. Although the feelings are still there, they're just not as intense. So making tasteful jokes about it, about what's stressing you out, or watching a funny movie or TV show can help the situation feel less overwhelming and upsetting. It's like that saying, laughter is the best medicine. Hobby-centered coping mechanisms are based on, you guessed it, your hobbies and how they make you feel. I know I've said this before, but I like to play piano and write songs when I'm feeling emotionally overwhelmed because it helps me cope with it. Or I draw, or make something useful like earrings or clothing because I like sewing. I also enjoy baking because it distracts me temporarily from what I'm thinking about and I come out with something productive and enjoyable. Sweets. I really highly suggest that whatever your hobbies are, use them to cope with situations. It will make you enjoy what you're doing and they will help reduce the stress. And last, physical activity related coping mechanisms. Exercise is a natural and healthy form of stress relief. Running, yoga, swimming, walking, doing sports, dancing, whatever it is, it releases endorphins that make you happy. So those are all healthy forms of coping mechanisms, but we all know that there are unhealthy coping mechanisms. These are called ineffective coping mechanisms. They cannot be used long-term and they can be counterproductive or have negative consequences. This is maladaptive coping, and these are not healthy. Escape-based coping mechanisms have to do with you withdrawing from people or isolating or absorbing yourself in something else. This could be a book, a TV show, a game, something that allows you to escape from your problems and from your feelings, and escape from your problems, feelings, and whatever the stressor is. Back to my earlier example, I used TV shows, I used fictional worlds to escape from the negative things I was feeling. It wasn't helping reduce the feelings because I wasn't dealing with them. It just helped me push it aside and forget about the stressors. But that was a avoidant and ineffective coping mechanism. The problems were always there when I got back from whatever fictional world I had escaped into. Now, that isn't to say that temporary distractions are a bad thing. They can be a really good thing. They cannot be used long-term in a healthy or effective way. They aren't permanent solutions. Unhealthy self-soothing coping mechanisms can begin as healthy but end as unhealthy because they're used longer than they are effective, such as overeating, drinking, abusing drugs, or excessive use of escaping into fictional worlds, as we've already talked about. This also looks like numbing coping mechanisms, which people use to numb the feelings instead of actually dealing with them or reducing them so they don't have to deal with the stress. This can again be overeating, abusing drugs, eating junk food, excessive alcohol use, and then there's self-destructive coping mechanisms. And the thing about ineffective, maladaptive, and self-destructive coping mechanisms is that there's a lot of overlap. There's two kinds of self-destructive coping mechanisms. There's compulsions and risk-taking, which really lies with addiction. That is drinking, drug abuse, gambling, risky sex, theft or deviant behavior, reckless driving, binge drinking, anything that is self-destructive. That can even be isolating yourself from everyone, or not doing all your schoolwork so you start doing poorly in school, or not doing your work so your career starts to go downhill. I mean, there's so many different ways to self-destruct and hurt yourself as a way to deal with the emotions, but it's not effective and it causes more harm than good. And then there's self-harming behaviors like cutting, burning, scratching, physical harm. But the thing about self-destructive coping mechanisms is that whether you're hurting yourself physically or hurting yourself emotionally, you're still hurting yourself, and that's not healthy. Maladaptive coping mechanisms will eventually and consistently have a negative impact on your emotional well-being. If you struggle with coping mechanisms, as I have, you can go to a therapist and work specifically on coping mechanisms mechanisms for what stressors you deal with. You could go to a school counselor or an on-campus counselor or therapist, and you don't even have to go for an extended period of time because I know that therapy is expensive. You could go a couple of times just to work on ways to help reduce your stress. There's also free online therapy sites, and while I've never used them, I know that they exist, and while they don't work well with complex trauma or emotional issues, they could definitely help with something like coping mechanisms. So here's just a list of healthy coping mechanisms, some that I didn't list: cleaning, coloring, cooking, drinking tea, gardening, listing things you feel grateful for, making a gratitude list, reminiscing on happy things like looking through old photos of good times, picturing your happy place mentally or going to your happy place, maybe that's somewhere out in nature, playing with your children or with a pet, practicing breathing exercises, praying if you're spiritual, reframing how you're looking at your problem, which is something a therapist can help with, squeezing a stress ball, doing self-care like painting your nails or doing a face mask, using aromatherapy, or just walking away from stressful situations. The important thing to understand is that everyone is different, and different coping mechanisms will work better for different people and in different situations. The same thing might not work every time, and sometimes you may need to do more than one, but you know yourself better than anyone else, so it's up to you to figure out what works. You may have coping mechanisms that I didn't talk about in here, and in fact, if you do, please comment them because I would love to know more coping mechanisms and you might help someone else out. I highly encourage you guys to choose healthy coping mechanisms, but I also know that we're all doing our best, and some avoidant, maladaptive, ineffective, and unhealthy coping mechanisms are better than no coping mechanisms. So try to take care of yourself, do the best that you can. In general, here's a list of unhealthy coping mechanisms to avoid: abusing alcohol or drugs, overeating, oversleeping, avoiding course loads or work, venting too much or venting too negatively, overspending, physically harming yourself, harming your relationships with others, isolating yourself, physically harming yourself, ruining your chances at being successful. I mean, there's so many different ways to do that, but just try not to do those things and try to choose healthy coping mechanisms. So that's what I have for you guys today. I hope this helped you. I hope this gave you some ideas for how to cope better with situations. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, and if you want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe. If you have any suggestions for video topics, please put them in the comments. If you have any coping mechanisms that really work for you that I didn't mention, please comment those as well. I would love to know about them. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great week.